Now, also speaking of World War II, in China, lots of people believe that now the West would say it is the two atomic bombs that dropped in Japan that ended the Japanese invasion or ended the Japanese or the forced Japan to surrender. But in China, lots of people believe it's actually the Soviet Union because Japan didn't immediately surrender after the two atomic bomb, but some people in Japan, pretty powerful forces, still believe they could somehow win this war because they were occupying Manchuria in China, and they had, I think, 700,000 troops there in Manchuria. So there's a theory that some Japanese high officials believe as long as they can hold on to Manchuria with their 700,000 strong soldiers there, even if they lose Japan, they can still somehow fight back. But then once the Soviet declared a war with Japan and came in, the Red Army came in, that's when they lost their hope. That was their last hope that they know it's not going to materialize. And that's when Japan surrendered. Do you agree that assessment?
I don't. It's not just I who agree with that assessment. I think many historians do, including, by the way, I believe many Japanese historians do. If you actually look at the debates that were taking place in Tokyo at this time, for one thing, the Japanese took some time to understand what the atomic bombs were, but the military crisis in China, in Manchuria, when the Soviets intervened, was in effect a death blow to them. They understood at that point that there was no conceivable way that they could end the war, win the war. Now, the important thing to say about the Asia War is that um, the narrative about it that the West has constructed is almost completely wrong because it is purely focused on the naval conflict between the United States and Japan. And, without in any way denying its importance, which is real. I mean, the Americans did conduct a very effective naval campaign against Japan. The main war, the one which killed far more Japanese, was the one that they were fighting first against China. In fact, overwhelmingly against China. That was the war that bled them dry. That was the war that exhausted their resources. And of course, also ultimately, the final knockout blow was when the Soviet Union joined the war, the war that the Chinese people had been fighting against Japan ever since 1937, and in fact, to a great extent, even before. The West has shifted the actual center of gravity of that war. They talk about it, as being a war fought over various island chains in the Pacific. Um, Whereas, of course, the real war was the one that was fought in China, in
Yeah.
Manchuria. That's where the big armies were. That's where, far and away, the greatest number of people, millions of people, died. That was the real war in the Pacific. Not that you would ever get Americans to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. It there's a the battle, of narratives. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's part of it. The story about World War II is also very important for the West to, I guess, to make the cases to support it, whatever their action today is somehow they save the world, right? They save Asia.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's why I think it somehow justified their hegemony in the world, their control and dominance in Asia. I got the feeling that's part of their justification that they somehow saved Asia. That they are the
Oh yes,
yeah.
there is a huge part of that. I mean, it has a political, it serves a political function. This narrative.
Mhm.
It's also true that every country which is involved in a war always imagines itself to be the biggest participant. I mean, you see this with the British. The British, after 1940, became a very secondary player in the Second World War. But that's not how the British perceive it. They still think of themselves as, fighting the Germans almost single handed, which is completely not true. And the Americans, understandably enough, have an exaggerated sense of their importance in fighting Japan. But those of us who care about objective history know that the real center of gravity
Mm.
of the war, it's not even a Pacific war, it's an Asia war,
Yeah.
was fought on the Asian mainland,
Mm.
um, principally in China.
Mm.
The Battle of Halkin Gol is connected with all of those events. Why were the Japanese able to invade Mongolia in 1939? Because they were already there occupying large areas of northern China in connection with the war they were fighting against the Chinese people. And of course, they were very hostile at that time to the Soviet Union and wanted to push it out of Asia because at that time already the Soviet Union was, to a certain extent at least, an ally of the Chinese. So, I mean, all of these things are connected with each other.
Talking about which connecting to each other. Apparently, this we talked about the China-Belarus military drill, right? Well, there is more to that story because I just thought Belarus want, China want to show that China is supporting Belarus and to just to send a signal. Well, apparently, if I remember correctly, Belarus very quickly joined the Shanghai Cooperation, and then immediately follow that was the drill, China Belarus. Well, the whole thing happened is because it seems like more and more evidence showing that NATO was serious about attacking Belarus.
Mm.
That they're first before they're doing the Kursk incursion, their first was thinking to attack Belarus to open a second front. Well, because of apparently they are very serious about that. And then the China-Belarus military drill happened, and China also made it very clear that if you guys do this, China will be seriously involved. That seems like a scared make NATO think twice. But then Kursk incursion happened. So it seems more and more evidence showing that the Belarus is their target. Seems like at one point very serious. Now, if you combine that with what's going on now in Japan, it is actually possible. I mean, NATO is not going to easily giving up. It seems to me that they're always thinking of something because the Kursk incursion doesn't do very well. So you combine that. So now they're thinking of Japan. It's quite plausible, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I think it's entirely plausible. As I said, it's crazy, it's irrational. But since when have these people behaved rationally? This is the problem. They are losing in Ukraine. You absolutely rightly say the Kursk incursion failed. It failed in its objective. It didn't cause the Russians to panic or redeploy their forces to Kursk to repel the Ukrainians there, or to rush and plead for negotiations. It didn't create a political crisis in Moscow. It did none of those things. But the political imperative the West has somehow to win in this war remains very strong. And so provoking a crisis in the Far East against Russia, setting the Japanese and the Russians off against each other, I can quite easily believe that there are people in Washington, in Brussels, who would say, well, look, it didn't work with Kursk, it hasn't worked with Belarus, which is, by the way, a small but very tough army, apparently, and which is it's got nuclear weapons on its territory because the Russians have it there, and the Chinese have just done joint exercises with it. So it doesn't work perhaps quite as they hope with Belarus. So let's try something in the Far East. Let's go for these islands, the Kuril Islands. Japan has its historic claim to them. This is the moment to solidify the alliance with Japan and to make it useful at last, to give to get the Japanese to show what they can do. I don't think this will be popular in Japan, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm not very well connected with Japan. I used to be many years ago, but I suspect that most people in Japan, if they woke up one morning and found that their country was at war with Russia, would not be happy. But there we are.
Well, you're correct in saying that if they start this attacking the Coral Islands and basically declare war with Russia, North Korea will withdraw because it's not long ago they established this basically de facto alliance agreement. So North Korea very much will get involved. Well, if North Korea get involved, China and North Korea has also alliance agreement.
Correct.
China will be drawn in as well. But isn't that possible that that's what the US wants? US wants China to get involved some kind of a proxy war, don't you think?
Well, it's possible, but what does the US gain ultimately? I mean, by the way, I agree. I mean, I understand that there aren't that Americans don't make these calculations very well, just as they thought if they started a proxy war against the Russians in Ukraine, that would bleed the Russians dry. They may be saying to themselves, if we start a conflict between Russia and Japan, that will drain China and complicate China's position in some way. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to horrify the world, and it's going to be eventually create a crisis for the USA. But quite plausibly, that is what some people think. One of the great problems about American policy making is that it's discussed, things are discussed and decided by a very, very small number of people operating in secret, not just in secret from the rest of the world, but in secret from their own people
Yeah.
and even large parts of their political system. So they don't get advice from experts and military people and economic people and things of that kind. So when decisions are made in this sort of way by people who imagine themselves to be much cleverer than they really are, and who are at the same time very, very ideological and very motivated and very angry and very frightened, you can imagine that you can easily imagine the kind of mistakes that get made. It's a point which I made many times, both in Moscow, where I understand the political system fairly well, and in Beijing, where I understand it less well, but I can nonetheless see the political system in operation. Policy making is very structured.
Mhm.
They make policy in a very structured way. Experts are consulted. People go through all the various possibilities. They weigh very carefully their decisions before they make them. It isn't like that at all in the United States.